The arbiter's voice carried the length of the pale hall, and every word of it was a lie. "By the reckoning of the circle," Halding Crow said, lifting his ringed hand toward the high seat where I sat, "the moon favors the house of Ostmere. Lady Sabline is named true mate to Raylar, king of Anwilt." The hall did not cheer. That was the first thing I noticed, sitting there with my crown too heavy and my hands too still. A true verdict brings a sound, a breath let go all at once, a rustle of relief that moves through a crowd the way wind moves through standing grain. This brought silence, the held-tight silence of 300 people who had watched a thing done in front of them and could not say aloud that it was wrong. I could say it. My whole body was saying it. But a king is bound by his own law, and the law of Anwilt was old and plain. The judging circle names the mate, and the king honors the nomming. My grandfather had built that law to keep the crown from choosing by whim or by lust, to keep some later king from waking beside a pretty face and calling it destiny. He had not built it, I think, to be bought. But then, my grandfather had believed the men who counted the moon signs were men who feared the moon. He had not lived to meet Halding Crow, who feared nothing that could not be weighed on a scale. Down on the trial floor, Lady Sabline of Ostmere rose from her cushioned chair and inclined her lovely head, and her father's men struck their palms against their chests in the old salute, and gold color moved through the crowd like a rumor. I looked at her and felt nothing. Not coldness, nothing, the way you feel nothing toward a well-made door. She was handsome and clever and had never once, in all the 11 days of the trial, looked at me as though I were a man and not a throne. She had looked at the crown. She had looked at the high seat. She had looked more than once at her father to check whether she was performing her part well. She had never looked at me, and I had told myself for 11 days that this was only her breeding, that great houses raise their daughters to keep their eyes where duty points them. And then I made the mistake I had been making for 11 days. I looked past her to the shadow at the foot of the western pillar where the servants stood. She was there. Of course she was there. She was always there, because someone had to carry the water and trim the wicks and keep the great cold hall from swallowing its own candlelight, and no one ever thought to send her away. She had a broom against her shoulder and a cloth over her arm, and she was watching the nomming with her chin level and her eyes steady. And when the arbiter said Ostmere, I saw something cross her face, not surprise, not grief for herself. She had nothing in this to lose. It was the look of a person who has just watched a scale come down wrong and knows, in her marrow, that a weight was hidden under the pan. Eloan. I did not know her house, because she had none worth nomming. I did not know her mother's name or her age, or whether she had ever in her life been given a thing she had not first earned twice over. What I knew was this, that 11 days ago, on the first morning of the trial, I had come down into the pale hall before the sun, unable to sleep, sick already of the reckoning that had not yet begun. And I had found a servant girl kneeling at the moon seal, wiping the old stone clean with a cloth so worn it was more whole than weave. I should tell you what happened in me, because everything turns on it, and I have never once been able to explain it to a council or a captain in a way that did not make me sound bewitched. All my life the moonlight in the pale hall had trembled. That is the truest word for it, a restless silver that never settled, that shivered on the walls and the flags like water that could not decide to be still. Every king of Anwilt lives with it. Every servant, every guard, every child born in the hold grows up beside it and stops seeing it the way you stop hearing your own heart. It is simply how the light is, in the pale hall, and no one thinks to wonder why, because a thing that has always been so seems as fixed as the stone under it. That morning, when she lifted her face and saw me standing in the doorway of my own hall, and startled, and began to scramble up with an apology already forming, the light stopped trembling. It went still. It lay across the stone and across her bent shoulders like something that had been running its whole life and had, at last, been allowed to rest. I had stood in the doorway like a boy caught out, and I had not understood it, and I had not been able to stop understanding it since. I did not tell her to rise. I did not tell her anything. I went back up the stair and stood at the arrow slit and watched the true dawn come, and I told myself it was the hour, the strange gray hour that had made the light seem to change. I am not a fanciful man. I have buried a father and a brother and put down 2 rebellions, and I do not see visions in the half-light. But the next morning I came again, and she was there again, kneeling, tending, and the moment she saw me the trembling stopped, and I stopped telling myself it was the hour. Your Grace, Halding Crow was watching me. He had eyes like wet slate, and they had followed my glance to the western pillar, and I saw him mark it, saw him file it away in whatever cold ledger he kept behind those eyes. The sealing rite waits on your word. Shall we bind the naming before the moon sets? The sealing rite. Once the verdict was sealed at the moon seal, once the king laid his hand on the stone and swore to honor the circle's naming, it could not be unmade. Not by a king, not by a war, not by the truth itself. That was the whole weight of the thing. A verdict spoken could still be argued in the days that followed. A house could petition, a king could stall, a wrong could, in theory, be caught before it hardened into law. A verdict sealed was law, final and cold and forever. Crow wanted it sealed tonight. He wanted it sealed before the moon set because a wrong is safest in the dark, and morning has a way of showing what candlelight hides. I should have said yes. The law said yes. 11 judges had said yes, and I did not have proof that a single coin had changed hands, only the certainty in my bones, which is not a thing a king may rule by. If every king who felt a thing in his bones overruled his own circle, there would be no law in Anwilt at all, only the appetite of whichever man wore the crown. I knew that. Crow knew I knew it. He was watching me hold the knowledge like a man watching a fish that has taken the hook decide whether to run. No, I said. The word went out into the silence, and the silence broke on it like a wave on stone. Halding Crow's face did not move, which told me more than any outburst could have. A man surprised looks surprised. A man who has planned for a thing and sees it arrive looks exactly as he looked before, because he has already had his surprise in private weeks ago when he first laid the plan. No, Your Grace. I will not seal tonight. I stood. Standing, I am a tall man, and the high seat is set high, and I used both, because a king who is losing the law must at least keep the room. The moon has been in the sky 11 nights. It will be there a 12th. I will seal the naming when I have looked at the reckoning myself with my own eyes at my own table. The reckoning is the circle's to keep. It is not the custom. The reckoning is Anwilt's, I said, and I am Anwilt. Bring it to my chamber before dawn, arbiter, or explain to the hold why the king's own hand is barred from the king's own law. It was not a victory. It was a night, one night, bought the way a drowning man buys a breath, knowing there is only water underneath. But Halding Crow bowed because a bought man must still bow, and the 11 gray judges bowed behind him, and Lady Sabline's smile stayed fixed and grew brittle at the edges like frost at the first breath of sun, and her father, Lord Ostmere, went the color of old tallow and did not bow at all until his daughter touched his sleeve. And at the foot of the western pillar, the servant girl was looking at me. Not the way the others looked, the guessing, weighing looks of a room trying to read its king. She was looking at me the way you look at a fire you thought had gone out and find still burning low under the ash. Then she remembered herself and dropped her eyes and bent to gather the trimmed wicks into her apron, and the moonlight in the pale hall, which had begun to tremble again the moment she looked down, I swear to you on the crown, went still. I went out through the small door behind the high seat before I could do the thing every part of me wanted, which was to cross the trial floor and take her hand in front of all of them and let the law fall where it would. A king does not have that freedom. That is the first thing they teach you and the last thing you believe. I want to tell you about the 11 days, because the naming did not fall out of a clear sky. It was built patiently in front of me, and I watched it being built and could not name the tool that was doing the building, and that is its own particular kind of torment. The trial of the moon is called when a king reaches his 30th year unmated. It is an old rite and a serious one. The circle gathers the daughters of the great houses and any woman the moon signs mark, and for a span of days they are read. Their blood traced back through the pack lines, their bearing weighed, the moon signs tallied on the nights of their births and the nights of the trial. It is meant to find the one the moon has meant for the crown. It is meant to be a thing beyond buying, because the moon cannot be bribed. The men who read it, though, the men who read it are only men. On the first day, Crow presented the candidates. There were 9 great house daughters, and 2 the signs had marked from lesser blood, and Sabline of Osmere stood at the head of them in gold, because Osmere had ridden hard on my western border for 3 years and my grandfather had promised them consideration at the next trial, and everyone in the hall understood that Osmere had come to collect. I remember thinking, wearily, that it would probably be her, and that it would probably be fine, a cold, clever Luna, a border secured, a crown doing the arithmetic crowns do. I remember feeling nothing about it, and thinking that a king does not marry for feeling, and telling myself the emptiness was duty and not warning. Then the second morning, and the seal, and the light going still under a servant's hands, and I stopped being able to feel nothing. I began to watch after that. Not her, I did not dare watch her, not with Crow's slate eyes in every room but the trial itself. And once I began to watch the trial the way a man watches a game he suspects is crooked, I could not stop seeing the loaded dice. Every sign fell to Osmere. Not most. Every one. On the 4th day the circle read the birth moons, and Sablines, they declared, had risen in the Luna's own quarter, a rare and favorable sign. On the 6th they read the bloodlines and found, 3 generations back, a thread of the old royal wolf in Osmere's tree that no herald had ever recorded before but which Crow produced, on a fresh vellum, in his own careful hand. On the 8th they tallied the trial moons night by night, and every night's tally leaned to gold. I sat through all of it. I have counted men and cattle and the coin of a kingdom, and I know that when a thing falls the same way 11 times running, it is not falling. It is being placed. But I could not point to the placing. That is the cruelty of a thing done by clever men. There was no lie a plain man could stand up and name. The birth moon reading was a matter of judgment, and the judges had judged. The royal thread in the bloodline came on a vellum I could not prove false. The tallies were arithmetic, and the arithmetic was correct. It was only the eyes doing the tallying that were bought, and you cannot arrest a man's eyes. 11 times I felt the dice come down wrong, and 11 times I looked for the hidden weight, and found only smooth, clean, unanswerable ivory. And through all 11 days, at the edge of the hall, the servant girl carried her water and trimmed her wicks and kept the light from dying, and every time she came near the seal the light went still, and no one but me was looking, because who looks at the woman who tends the lamps? She was furniture to them. She was less than furniture. Furniture at least gets noticed when it needs mending. Once on the 9th day, Lady Sabline dropped her glove, and Aloin knelt and retrieved it and held it up, and Sabline took it without a glance, without a word, the way you take a thing from the air, and I sat on the high seat and felt something turn over in me that was not proper for a king to feel toward one candidate on behalf of a servant. I felt it anyway. I have stopped apologizing for it. By the 11th day, I knew 2 things with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof. The first was that the naming of Osmere was bought. The second was that the moon had meant the girl at the pillar, and that if I let the right run its course I would seal a lie into the oldest law of my house, and stand a bribed woman at my side until the day I died, and pass the crooked crown to a child who was not born of the moon's meaning at all. So when Crow said, "Shall we bind the naming?" I said no, and bought myself a night, and went up the stair to read a reckoning I already knew would be flawless, because the men who had built it were too good to leave a seam a plain hand could pick. My father used to say that the moon seal chose the first king of Anwilt, and that every king since has only borrowed it. He said it the way men say the old things, half in belief and half in habit, the way you touch the doorpost on your way out of a house your grandmother told you to touch. I had laid my hand on the seal at my crowning like every king before me, and felt nothing but cold stone, and thought, as young men do, that the old things were only stories dressed in ceremony to make the ceremony feel heavier than it was. I want to tell you what the seal is, because everything turns on it. It sits in the floor at the center of the pale hall, a disk of pale gray stone the width of a shield, set flush with the flags, worn smooth by 100 crownings and 1,000 oaths. There is no mark on it, no rune, no carving. It is only stone, paler than the flags around it, the way a scar is paler than the skin. There is a saying, older than the law, older than the hold itself. The moon seal cannot be lied to. No one living had seen it do anything but sit there and be old. It had not woken, truly woken, the way the stories mean, with light of its own, in the memory of any man alive. My grandfather claimed his grandfather had seen it wake once, at a crowning where two brothers both laid claim, and that it had blazed for the younger and gone dark for the elder, and ended a war before it began. That is how far back you had to reach to find someone who believed. That is how far the old things had retreated into rumor. The trial did not need the seal to wake. The trial was the circle's affair, a reckoning of blood and bearing and the reading of the moon signs, all of it done by men, all of it, I understood now, purchasable by men. The seal was only for the sealing rite, the last step. A king laid his hand on it and swore to honor the naming, and the stone stayed cold, and the oath was made and could never be unmade. The seal had never been asked to choose. In living memory, it had only ever witnessed, sat cold and gray under the king's hand while he swore, a silent stone lending its old weight to a decision already made. It only witnessed, turned that over slowly, the way I turned it over that night with the reckoning open in front of me. It had never been asked to choose because no one had ever needed it to, because in 300 years no king had ever doubted a verdict enough to put it to the one thing in Anvil that could not be bought. The seal was not asleep because it was powerless. It was asleep because no one had ever been desperate enough to wake it. I sat in my chamber that night with the circle's reckoning open on the table in front of me, and it was, as I had known it would be, a beautiful piece of work. Every sign read for Ostmir, the bloodlines traced true, the new royal thread laid in among the old ones so neatly you would think it had always been there. The moon signs, tallied in Halding Crow's own careful hand, all fell to Sabline. There was no lie in it that a man could point to and say, there, that is false. It was worse than a lie. It was a lie made entirely of true-seeming things, which is the only kind that survives daylight, the only kind clever men ever bother to build. I read it 3 times. Each time I found nothing to seize, and each time the nothing was heavier. I had a night, and at the end of the night I would have to seal or refuse, and refusing without proof would make me a king who overruled his own law for a feeling, which is the exact tyranny the law was built to prevent. Crow had not merely stolen the verdict. He had built it so that fighting it would make me the villain of the very principle I was trying to defend. I sat with my head in my hands and understood, for the first time in 9 years of ruling, what it is to be perfectly, lawfully trapped. There was a knock, the light, apologetic knock of someone who is not sure they are allowed to knock at all. Enter. She came in with a taper because that was her task. The king's chamber lamps were trimmed and lit each night by a hall servant, and tonight the hall servant was her, because someone had sent her, or because no one had thought to send anyone else, which in that hold amounted to the same thing. She did not look at me. She crossed to the far lamp with her eyes down and her back straight, and she was 3 steps into the room before she saw the reckoning open on the table and stopped as though she had walked into glass. "Elowen," I said. I had learned her name on the second morning of the trial, from a cook, the way you learn the name of a thing you have decided you need. Saying it aloud in my own chamber felt like a trespass and a homecoming at once. She turned. In lamplight she was not the servant the trial had made her, bent, silent, invisible. She was only a young woman with tired eyes and a strong plain face and her hair coming loose from its binding, and she was looking at me with something I had not earned and did not know what to do with. "Your Grace," Her voice was low, careful. "Forgive me. I'll come back when the hour is." "Stay." It came out too hard, a command where I had meant a request, and I saw her flinch and hated myself. I gentled it. "Please, stay a moment." She stayed, but she set the taper down on the near table and folded her hands in front of her apron, and I understood that she had made herself into a servant standing before a king again, deliberately, the way you put on armor before you walk into a room you do not trust. It was the wisest thing she could have done, and I hated that too. "You keep the pale hall," I said. "Yes, your grace." "You tend the seal." A flicker of something behind her eyes. "I tend the floor around it. The seal tends itself." A pause, and then, because I said nothing, filling the silence the way frightened people fill it. "The moonlight comes strangest there. It needs no help from me. I only keep the stone from the dust, so the light has something clean to lie on." So the light has something clean to lie on. I have been a king for 9 years and been given 1,000 speeches by clever men, speeches oiled and weighted and aimed, and not one of them ever said a thing as true as that, said plain, by a servant who did not know she had said anything at all. "How long," I asked, "have you kept it?" "Since I was small." She said it without weight, a fact and not a grief, which is its own kind of grief. "My mother kept it before me. I don't remember her. The seal keeper who came after her found me sleeping on the flags one morning. I'd have been 3 or 4, and there was no one to say I didn't belong to the work, and it was warm there, warmer than anywhere in the hold, so I did the work and I grew into it, and no one ever thought to ask whether I should be doing something else, because there was never anyone to ask." She stopped herself, and color came into her plain face. "Forgive me. You didn't ask for my life." "I did, though," I said. "I asked exactly for that." She looked at me then, really looked, the servant's armor slipping, and the taper flame on the table between us stood very straight in the still air, and I felt the whole strange truth of the last 11 days rise up in my chest and demand to be spoken. And I, a king, bound by his law, with a false verdict cooling on his table and a bought arbiter counting the hours until I sealed it, I said none of it. Because to say, "I think you are my fated mate," and 11 bought men have named another, and I cannot prove it, and if I say it aloud and cannot make it law, I have only marked you for their spite, that is not devotion. That is a burden dressed as a gift, handed to a woman who has spent her whole life being handed burdens by men who called them gifts. So instead I said, "Do you know what the seal is for?" "For the sealing." She said it simply, glad, I think, to be back on the firm ground of a thing she knew. "When the king honors the naming. My mother's book says the king lays his hand and swears, and the stone stays cold and the oath is bound." She hesitated. "It says one more thing, but it's only an old rhyme. My mother wrote the household things in it, how to trim the great wicks so they don't smoke when the moon comes through which shaft, and the rhymes the old keepers passed down. The rhyme about the seal is only a keeper's rhyme. It doesn't mean anything." "Tell me the rhyme." She looked at the door, as though the rhyme were a thing she could be beaten for knowing above her station. Then she said it low, in the sing-song of a thing learned in earliest childhood, before you know what the words are for. "The circle counts and the circle names, but the moon seal knows what the circle can't. Lay 2 hands where the false hand lies. The stone stays dark for the borrowed heart, and wakes for the one the moon has meant." The lamp flame stood straight. Outside, past the arrow slit, the moon was a hand's width from the western hills, sliding down toward the setting that would have ended everything if I had let the sealing run. "Say it again," I said, "the middle part." "Lay 2 hands where the false hand lies." She frowned, working it the way she must have worked it 100 idle times, a child puzzling out a rhyme with no idea it was a key. "I always thought it meant if 2 claim the crown's mate and one is false, you can put them both to the stone. The false one's hand, the stone stays dark. The true one's hand." She stopped. Her face changed. She had heard at last what she was saying, and to whom, and on what night, and with what open on the table between them. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice had dropped almost to nothing. "It's only a rhyme. Keepers make rhymes for everything. There's one about which drain floods in spring. It doesn't mean the seal. When two claim to be the crown's true mate, I said slowly, and the circle has named one and the king doubts the naming, then the right allows the king to call the seal's own witness. Does the rhyme say that, or the book? The book says, she wet her lips. The book says the named mate lays her hand on the seal before the king swears. It's part of the rite. Everyone forgets it because it never does anything. She lays her hand. The stone stays cold. The king swears it's done. My mother wrote that no one even remembers to do it properly anymore. The arbiter just waves it through. She looked at me, and I watched her understand the whole shape of the thing at the same moment I did, the two of us arriving at it together across a servant's rhyme and a mother's household book. The named mate lays her hand, she said again, very quietly. The right already puts a hand on the stone. It's already there. It's always been there. It's just that no one ever laid a second hand beside it, I finished, because no one was ever wronged enough to ask. The rhyme was not proof. A rhyme in a servant's book is not a thing a king rules by any more than a feeling in his bones. But it was a door in a law I had thought had no doors, a way to turn the trap that Crow had built against him. If I could not prove the reckoning false with a plain man's finger, I did not have to. I could put it to the one thing in Anwilt that had never in 300 years been asked to lie, in front of the whole hold, where no vellum and no gold and no clever tally could reach it. But it would cost, and most of the cost would fall on her. Eloan, I said, and my voice was not a king's voice at all. If I asked you to lay your hand on the seal before them, before the circle, before all of Ostmere and the whole of the hold, would you do it? The fear that crossed her face was not for herself. I have seen a great deal of fear in 9 years of ruling, and I have learned to read whose it is. This was fear for me. Your Grace, they've named her. The circle has named her in front of everyone. If you set the nomming aside for a keeper's rhyme, for a servant who trims your lamps, they'll say you, she could not finish it. The words for what they would say were not words a servant said to a king's face. Bewitched. Faithless. A king who broke the oldest law of his house, because a girl who sleeps by the seal turned his head. Let them say it, I said. Would you do it? And the girl who had been made small for 11 days, who had folded herself into a servant standing before a king twice already in this single conversation, straightened all the way up spine, shoulders, chin, and something came into her face that the trial had never once let me see. Not defiance. Nothing so loud, nothing that needed an audience. It was certainty. The plain, bottomless certainty of a person who has spent her whole life close to a true thing, and knows the difference between it, and a lie the way you know the difference between your own two hands. The seal cannot be lied to. She said, that's the first thing my mother's book says before any of the rhymes. Not the seal is powerful, not the seal is holy, just it cannot be lied to. If I lay my hand and it stays dark, then I am nothing, and I have always been nothing, and I'll go back to the flags and be glad of the warmth and no worse off than I was this morning. She drew a breath. But if I lay my hand, Your Grace, it won't stay dark. I've knelt beside that stone since before I could speak. I've slept beside it. I've cleaned it 10,000 mornings and watched the light gather to it, and never once to me, and never once wondered why the light won't settle in that hall, because I was a child, and children don't wonder about the thing that's always been true. But you asked me just now whether I tend the seal, and I heard my own answer, and Your Grace, the light goes still when I come near it. It's been going still for me my whole life, and I never let myself see it because a servant who thinks the moon means her is a servant asking to be laughed at. Her voice did not shake. Her eyes were bright and level. It won't stay dark for me. I don't know how a thing like me knows a thing like that, but I know it the way I know my own name. The moonlight in the chamber, the ordinary moonlight, the plain kind that falls through every arrow slit in the world, lay across the floor between us, and I noticed, did not tremble. Then I ask you, I said, not as your king. A king can command you to the seal and you'd have no choice, and I will not do that because a thing you're commanded to isn't yours. I ask you the way one person asks another. Will you stand before the whole hold and lay your hand on a stone that cannot be lied to, knowing what they'll say if it stays dark, and knowing worse what some of them will do if it wakes? She was quiet for a moment, then a smile touched the corner of her mouth, small and dry and braver than any oath. You keep asking me as though the frightening part is the stone, she said. The stone doesn't frighten me at all, Your Grace. I know the stone, it's the only thing in this hold I've never been afraid of. She picked the taper back up habit or to have something in her hands. Yes, she said. I'll lay my hand, light your lamps first. If I'm to overturn a kingdom before dawn, I'd rather do it in a well-lit room. I laughed. It surprised us both. A king does not laugh much in the 11th night of a stolen trial. But she had made a joke, standing at the edge of the abyss, and it was a good one. And I understood in that moment that whatever the stone did or did not do, I had already been claimed, days ago, by a woman kneeling in the pre-dawn making the light a clean place to lie. I will not pretend the hours that followed were a triumph. The hardest part of any true thing is the stretch before it, when it is still only your word against the world's arrangement, and the arrangement has all the weight of custom and gold and 11 gray men, and your word has a rhyme in a dead woman's book. I sent before anything for the reckoning keeper, old Bevis, who had served the circle 40 years as its clerk and archivist, who kept the true records in the vault below the circle's chamber, and who, I gambled, loved the circle itself more than he loved any single verdict Osmir's gold could buy. It was a gamble. If I was wrong about Bevis, he would carry my hand straight to Crow, and I would have shown my whole play a night early. He came half-dressed and blinking, an old man roused at the dark end of the night, and when he saw the reckoning open on my table his face did a thing I have thought about many times since. It closed, not with guilt, but with grief. The grief of a man who has spent 40 years tending a thing and watched it be poisoned and told himself, night after night, that it was not his place to speak. I asked him one question first, plainly, to see how he'd take it. Bevis, did you tally the trial moons this year? He was silent a long moment. Then, no, Your Grace, 40 years I've kept the tally. This year the arbiter kept it himself, said my hand had grown unsteady. He held up his hand. It was steady as stone. We both looked at it. I taught Halding Crow the counting, he said quietly, 30 years ago when he came to the circle a clerk like me. I know what a true tally looks like and I know how it's built. And I've read what's on your table, Your Grace, this last hour in my own head because I've had 11 days to read it in the hall. That is not a tally. That is a tally's clothes with something else wearing them. Can you prove it? Not the way you'd want. Every number in it is defensible on its own. That's the craft of it. He came closer to the table, and his old clerk's fingers hovered over the vellum without touching, the way a man's hand hovers over a wound. But I kept the true birth moon records for 40 years, Your Grace, in the vault in my own hand, going back before Crow. And Lady Sabline's birth moon did not rise in the Luna's quarter. I recorded it the night she was born. I rode to Osmir myself. It was my office then. It rose in the Wolf's Quarter, a common sign, a fine sign, but not the rare one they've written here. And the royal thread in the Osmir bloodline. His mouth thinned. There is no royal thread in the Osmir bloodline. I could trace that tree in my sleep. It was drawn onto fresh vellum this season. I'd stake my 40 years on it, and my 40 years is all I have. Then why? I asked. And I asked it gently, because I already half knew the answer and it was not a thing to be cruel about. Did you not come to me? The old man looked at me, and there were tears standing in his eyes, the helpless tears of the aged. Because who am I, Your Grace? A clerk. Because the arbiter is the arbiter and the circle is the circle, and I am one old man with a book. And if I had come to you and said the tally is false and you had asked me prove it, I could not have, not to a court, not against Crow's clean numbers. He'd have called it an old man's jealousy, a clerk passed over, sour that his hand was called unsteady. And then I'd have been dismissed, and the true records would have been mine no longer, and there would have been no one left in that vault who remembered what the truth even looked like. I told myself I was keeping the records safe by keeping my mouth shut. I told myself that for 11 days. He wiped his face, unashamed, the way the very old are unashamed. I'm ashamed of it, your grace. But you didn't send for me to hear an old man be ashamed. You sent for me because you mean to do something. So tell me what, and let me stop being ashamed. So I told him, all of it, the seal, the rhyme, the door, and the right. And I asked him one question that everything hung on. Does the letter of the right allow it? The named mate lays her hand, that much I know. But can the king, before he swears, call the seal's witness against the naming? Or am I clutching a servant's rhyme? Bevis was quiet for a long time. Then he did something I did not expect. He laughed, a dry, cracked, wondering laugh, an old man's laugh at the strangeness of the world. The letter allows it, he said. The letter has always allowed it, your grace. It is written in the right itself, in the first version, the one my predecessor's predecessor copied fair, the one nobody's read in 100 years, because the rights become a mumble the arbiter waves through. And should the king, ere he swear, hold doubt of the naming, he may summon the seal to witness, and lay the doubted hand and the doubting hand together upon the stone, and abide its judgment. It's there. The keeper's rhyme your servant knows is only the plain speech of the law. It was never a legend. It was the law worn down into a nursery song because no king in 300 years was ever fool enough. He caught himself, and smiled, wet-eyed, or wronged enough or brave enough to use it. Ask the stone, your grace. I'll bring the fair copy up from the vault. I'll stand at your side and read the letter of the law when they scream that you've broken it. Let an old man be of some use before the moon sets on him for good. I could have wept myself then if kings wept. Instead, I gripped his shoulder and sent him down to the vault for the fair copy and the true records, and I felt, for the first time in 11 days, the ground come up solid under my feet. Halding Crow came at dawn with the reckoning I had already read as I had commanded, and he came smiling, which I had counted on. A man who has built a perfect trap comes to spring it smiling. Your grace has had his night, he said, laying the vellum on my table beside the copy already there, not noticing, not yet, that there were 2 copies now, and a fair old one besides, and old Bevis standing gray and silent by the wall with his hands folded, and his 40 years finally, terribly on his face. I trust the king's own eyes find the reckoning sound. It wants only your hand on the seal to bind it, and the moon rises again at dusk. We might have the sealing done tonight and the hold at peace by. There will be a sealing tonight, I said, but not the one you came for. He stopped. The smile stayed, but it stopped meaning anything, the way a lamp stays lit after the flame's gone out of the wick on habit and residue. Your grace. The rite will be held tonight at the noon of the moon in the pale hall, not behind a closed door with you and me and a witness or 2, in the open before the whole hold. Every servant, every smith, every herder, every soul in Anwilt who cares to come, and they will care to come, arbiter, I think you'll find the hall full. I watched him. Lady Sabline will lay her hand on the seal, as the rite requires of a named mate. And before I swear, I will invoke the seal's witness, as the rite allows, and lay a second hand beside hers, and abide the stone's judgment. I watched him understand it. I watched the wet slate eyes go, for one instant, to a place far beyond me, to the vellum and the clean numbers and the drawn-in royal thread, to 30 years of craft, all of it about to be laid on a stone that could not be lied to and had no eyes to read a tally and no price a house could meet. He was a clever man, Halding Crow, cleverer by far than the men who'd bought him, and I watched him do, in the space of 3 breaths, the arithmetic of his own ruin. He recovered. Bought men are practiced at recovering. It is half of what they're for. The seal has not woken in 300 years, your grace, he said, and his voice was smooth again, almost kind, the voice of a man explaining a hard truth to a boy. You would stake the peace of the hold, the trust of your own circle, on a stone that will, in all likelihood, do nothing whatever. It will sit gray and cold under 2 hands as it has sat cold under every hand for 3 centuries, and you will have humiliated a great house, doubted your own law before the common folk, and made yourself the king who set aside a lawful naming for, forgive me, for whatever it is that has drawn the king's eye to the western pillar these 11 days. The whole hold has seen you look, your grace. Do not imagine I am the only one who counts. It was well aimed. He was telling me the true shape of my risk, which is the cleverest kind of threat, the kind that hides inside honest counsel. If the stone stayed dark, I would be exactly the king he described, and Aloan would be exactly the servant he implied, and every day after would be built on that ruin. You may be right, I said. The stone may do nothing. Then the Naming stands arbiter. I will lay my hand and swear the oath to Ostmir, and I will kneel before the circle and beg its pardon for my doubt in front of all the hold I doubted it before, and you will have your verdict and your peace, and I let it land soft and whatever else you have already been paid. His face did not move. A man does not need to flinch to bleed. But if the stone wakes howling, if it wakes for a hand you did not name, then every man of the circle answers for a tally that lied, and the answering will be public, because the wrong was public, and the stone's judgment is not a thing that can be argued in a back room with a purse. So, you had best hope with your whole heart that the old things are only stories. You've wagered a great deal on there being stories already, I think. Tonight you'll find out whether you wagered right. He left. He did not bow. And that more than any word he'd said told me that he knew the seal was not a story, knew the way a man knows the thing he spent his life pretending not to know. Old Bevis let out a long breath by the wall when the door had shut. He's afraid, your grace, the old man said. 40 years I've watched that man, and I've never seen him afraid. He knows the stone. Then so will everyone, I said, by moonrise. Word went through the hold that day the way only the true words go, not carried by heralds who carry the words the crown once carried, but lo, hand to hand in the passages and the yards and the kitchens, the way water finds every crack in a wall. The king will not seal. The king has called the stone. There's to be a witnessing tonight, an old witnessing, the kind from the rhymes. And under it, quieter, the word that mattered most, the servant. The one that keeps the seal, he's called the servant to the stone. I did not spread it. I did not need to. The hold spread it because the hold had watched a wrong being done for 11 days, had felt the dice come down wrong even where it could not name the weight, the way common folk always feel these things sooner than their betters, because they have less to gain from pretending otherwise. And now, unlooked for, they had been handed a reason to hope the wrong might be undone in front of them. That is a thing people will fill a hall for. That is a thing people will stand 3 deep in a cold gallery half the night for. Not the crowning, not the gold. The chance to watch the truth arrive in a place where they had given up expecting it ever to come. I went down once in the gray of the afternoon to the pale hall and found Aloan there. Of course I found her there. She was on her knees at the seal with her worn cloth, cleaning it, cleaning the very stone she would kneel on that night to remake or unmake her whole life. With the same plain care, she had given it 10,000 mornings when no one was watching and nothing was at stake. You needn't, I said. Tonight of all nights you needn't. She looked up. It'll have the eyes of the whole hold on it tonight, she said. It should be clean. And then, with that dry, small smile, and if it's the last morning's work I ever do as a servant, I'd like it done well. I've never left a task half finished for anyone, your grace. I'm not going to start with the moon watching. I knelt down beside her. A king does not kneel on the flags of his own hall in the afternoon. I knelt anyway, and I took the worn cloth out of her hand, gently. She let me, and I wiped a stretch of the pale stone myself, clumsily, the way you do a thing you have never once been asked to do, and she watched me do it with a look on her face I have kept all these years like a coin in a pocket. Whatever the stone does tonight, I said, cleaning the old gray stone beside her, I want you to know it before it does it, so you never wonder whether I only chose you because a rock lit up. The stone doesn't make a thing true, Aloan. It only says the true thing out loud where liars can't shout over it. You were the moon's meaning before I walked into this hall 11 days ago. You'll be the moon's meaning if the stone stays black as coal and I lose my crown for saying so. The stone is for them. I nodded at the walls, the hold, the world. Not for me. I've known since the second morning. She was quiet, working the cloth. Then, without looking up, "You never told me 11 days." "How could I tell you," I said, "when I couldn't make it law? To tell you would only have painted the mark on you a week early. I'd sooner have kept silent forever and let you be safe than speak and make you a target I couldn't defend." She stopped cleaning. She looked at me, really looked, the afternoon light lying still across the stone between our two kneeling shadows. "That," she said quietly, "is the difference between you and every man who ever handed a burden to a girl like me and called it a gift. You'd have carried it alone forever to keep it off my back." She reached out and, greatly daring, laid her hand over mine on the cloth. Her hand was rough with work and warm. "Don't. Whatever comes tonight, don't carry it alone. That's all I want, more than a crown, more than the stone lighting. I've been alone with everything my whole life. Don't make me a queen who's still alone." "Never," I said. "It is the only oath I have ever sworn that I did not have to think about first. Never, as long as I breathe." The light lay still across the stone, and across her hand on mine, and neither of us moved for a while, in the gray afternoon in the empty hall, before the hardest night of both our lives. The pale hall was fuller that night than I have ever seen it before or since. They packed the walls. They filled the gallery 3 and 4 deep, the smiths still in their leather, the herders come down from the high pastures, the kitchen folk and the stable folk and the old and the young, and the great house lords in their finery islanded among the common flood like stones in a river, and every one of them silent with the particular silence of a crowd that has come to see whether a wrong will hold or break. The moonlight came down through the high shafts and fell on the gray seal in the center of the floor and trembled. Silver and restless, across the stone, the way it had trembled since before my grandfather's grandfather, the way I had stopped seeing years before I ever found a servant kneeling in it and felt it go still. I sat the high seat. Old Bevis stood at the foot of it with the fair copy of the rite in his hands, the true old copy from the vault, his 40 years standing straight in him at last. The circle stood in their gray along the eastern wall, 11 men, and Halding Crow at their head with his hands folded into his sleeves and his slate eyes fixed on the seal, and I watched him watch it, and I saw a man looking at his own scaffold. Lady Sabline stood in her gold at the seal's edge, composed, beautiful, her chin high, her father Lord Ostmere a pace behind her with a face like a shut and bolted gate. She did not look at me. She looked at the stone and once, quickly, at her father, checking her part. And at the western pillar in the plain undyed wool of a shrine servant, with her hair bound back and her hands folded and her chin level, stood Aloan. I had offered her a gown that afternoon. The crown could dress her as a lady in an hour. She had refused it gently, but she had refused. "If the stone wakes for me," she had said, "let it wake for what I am. If you put me in a lady's gown first, they'll say it was the gown that lit it, or the king's favor, or a trick. Let them see a servant kneel. Let the stone speak over the top of the wool." She was wiser than my whole council. I had long since stopped being surprised by it and started simply being grateful. Bevis read the rite in his cracked old voice, every word of the letter from the fair old copy, and the hall was so silent you could hear the wicks she had trimmed, hiss and settle in their sconces. He read the nomming. He read the calling of the candidates. And when he came to the place where the named mate lays her hand, the place Crow's circle had waved through as an empty custom for 100 years, Bevis read it full and slow, and Lady Sabline of Ostmere stepped up onto the pale seal and knelt in her gold and laid her palm flat on the old gray stone. Nothing. The stone stayed gray. The moonlight went on trembling across it, across her gold sleeve, silver and cold and indifferent. And that was correct, that was the right as it had run for 300 years. The named mate lays her hand, the stone does nothing. The king rises and swears, the oath is bound and cannot be unmade. Sabline waited, palm down, composed, for me to rise and cross the floor and lay my hand beside hers and speak the oath that would end it. Her father's shut-gate face eased by a hair. Along the eastern wall, 1 or 2 of the gray judges let out held breath. It was going as it always went. I rose, and I did not go to swear. "Hold," I said. The word went out over the silent hall and stopped Sabine half risen. The rite is not finished. Bevis, read the next passage, the one that has not been read in this hall in 300 years. And old Bevis lifted the fair copy in his shaking hands and read, in his cracked and carrying voice, into a silence you could have cut and stacked like turf. And should the king, ere he swear hold doubt of the naming, he may summon the seal to witness, and lay the doubted hand and the doubting hand together upon the stone, and abide its judgment. The hall drew one long breath and held it. Along the eastern wall, the 11 gray men went very still. Halding Crow's folded hands did not move. I hold doubt of the naming, I said. My voice filled the hall the way Crow's voice had filled it 11 nights before, and there was no lie in mine, and the whole hold could hear the difference, because a room always can in the end if you make it listen. By the letter of the law of Anwilt, as it is written in the true copy and read here by the circle's own keeper of 40 years, I summon the seal to witness. 2 women stand in this hall who might be the moon's meaning for the crown. The circle has named one. I doubt the naming. Let the other lay her hand where the first hand lies. Let the stone that cannot be lied to say, before the whole hold which the moon has meant. Sabine was on her feet now, and her composure had gone thin as first ice, and her father Lord Ostmere had taken a step forward before 2 of my guard, who had their orders, took a quiet step to match him. "Your Grace," Crow said, and his voice was still smooth, still almost kind, playing the last card he had. "This is a servant. You would set a lamp girl beside a daughter of Ostmere at the crown's own seal, on the strength of a keeper's rhyme before the whole." "I would set a hand beside a hand," I said, "and let the stone tell you whose. If you are so certain of your reckoning, arbiter, you have nothing to fear from a cold, gray rock, unless you fear it. Do you fear it, Haldane?" I let the hall hear the question. Does the arbiter of the circle fear the seal at the heart of his own law? He had no answer to that. There was no answer to that. To object further was to confess, in front of 300 people, that he expected the stone to disagree with his own naming. He closed his mouth. It was the loudest thing he did all night. "If the stone stays dark under both hands," I said to the whole hall now, "then the naming stands, and I will kneel to the circle's wisdom and beg the hold's pardon for my doubt in this same place before you all. The king wagers his own honor on the stone tonight, no less than the honor of any man he doubts. Let no one say the king risked less than he asked others to risk." I turned. Elowen. She came from the western pillar. Across the whole length of that packed and breathless hall she came, in her undyed wool, with her hair bound plain and her strong plain face and her level chin, and not one soul laughed, though 11 days before that whole trio would have laughed to see a lamp girl walk toward the crown's own seal, would have thought it the funniest thing in a dull season. No one laughed now. The hall had felt the wrong for 11 days, and it had come to see the wrong tested, and it watched her cross the floor the way you watch the one honest thing in a room full of arranged ones. She reached the seal. She looked up at me once, and not for permission. I think she looked to give me a last chance to save myself, to see whether I would call it off now that it was real and irreversible and the whole hold was watching. I did not call it off. I gave her the smallest nod a king can give, and it cost me more than the crown ever had. She knelt on the pale stone the way she must have knelt 10,000 mornings, easy, unafraid, at home in the one place in the hold that had never frightened her. Besides Sabine's gold, her wool looked poorer than ever, and it did not matter, because the light was already beginning to change, and only I, who had watched it for 11 days, could see it starting. She laid her palm flat on the pale stone, where the false hand had lain, and the trembling stopped. It did not stop the way a candle is pinched out. It stopped the way a held breath is let go, all the restless silver in the pale hall, all the light that had shivered on those walls since before the memory of anyone living, gathered itself in a single held moment and went still. And then it ran. Down the high shafts, along the flags, across the gray disk it ran, silver drawn to silver, and it pooled beneath her hand, and the seal woke. I have no better word for it. It woke. The pale stone took light the way still water takes light, not reflected but from within, a low clean silver rising up out of the gray as though it had been down inside the stone the whole 300 years, waiting, and it spread out from beneath Elohim's palm in a slow widening ring, until the whole seal was a disk of standing moonlight, steady, unshivering and warm. I could feel the warmth of it from the high seat, 10 paces off, a warmth like a hand laid gently on the back of your neck by someone who has known you your whole life and loved you the whole time, and only now, at last, can say so. 300 people made no sound at all. For the length of 3 breaths the pale hall held a silence deeper than any I have heard before or since. And then, from the walls, from the gallery, from the smiths and the herders and the kitchen folk and the old women who had come down half the night through the cold to see whether a wrong might break, there rose a sound I will hear until the day I die. Not a cheer, a sob. A great, low, broken exhalation from 300 throats at once, the sound of a whole people watching the truth arrive after they had given up, quietly and long ago, on ever expecting it to come. Some of them wept openly. An old woman near the seal's edge sank straight to her knees on the flags. A big smith by the eastern wall put his leather-gloved hand over his own mouth like a boy. And the light held steady, warm, waking, risen for the servant girl kneeling on the stone in her plain wool, and stayed dark and cold as a dead coal where the daughter of Osmir had knelt a moment before. Sabine stepped back from the seal. She did it slowly, and there was no anger in her face. That surprised me and has stayed with me. Only a kind of dawning, dreadful relief, the look of a woman who has been carried toward a thing by other people's hands for so long that the ending of the carrying, however it ends, comes almost as a mercy. Her father, Lord Ostmere, had gone the color of ash and grabbed at the arm of the man beside him. And Haldane Crow stood at the head of his 11 gray men and looked at the waking stone, at the low, clean, risen silver he had wagered his whole life on being only a story, and I watched his face, and I will tell you what was in it. Not fear at the last, something worse for a man like him. It was the face of a man who had known, always in the deep place he never visited, that the old things were true and had bet against them anyway, for gold, and had just watched them prove themselves in front of the whole world, and now had to live inside the knowing for whatever was left of his life. I came down from the high seat. The law was fulfilled. The stone had spoken. There was nothing now that Haldane Crow or Osmir's gold or 300 years of worn-down custom could do to unspeak it, because 300 people had seen it with their own eyes, and a thing 300 people have seen cannot be tallied away in any gray man's careful hand. I crossed the floor, and I did the thing I had wanted to do for 11 days and been forbidden by everything, and now was commanded to do by the only law that stands above a king, which is the truth. I unclasped my cloak, the king's cloak, the gray and silver of Anwilt, that no shoulders but the crowns had worn in 9 years, and I knelt down beside her on the waking, warm, silver stone, king though I was, in front of the whole hold, and I laid the cloak around her plain wool shoulders, and I took her free hand in both of mine. The circle counts, I said low, meant for her, though the risen silence of the hall carried it to every corner, but the moon has meant. It meant you before I was crowned. It meant you before you had a name to give me, when a keeper found a small child asleep on these very flags because they were the only warm thing in the hold. The stone knew you before I let myself know you. All I did was stop lying to myself a little sooner than a bought man could stop me. Her eyes were wet and steady on mine, and her hand had turned in mine and gripped it, hard, the way she had gripped the cloth that afternoon. I will not ask you to be my Luna because a stone has lit, I said. You told me yourself the stone doesn't make a thing true, it only says the true thing where liars can't shout over it. So I'll not hide behind it. I ask you because for 11 days you have been the only still thing in a hall that never once stopped trembling, and I have been a king my whole life, and never once been at peace until I found you on your knees making the light a clean place to lie. Elohim, stand with me. Not because the circle named you, it didn't, it named against you, and I'd have you anyway. Not because the stone woke, it only agreed with what I already knew. Stand with me because I have chosen you plainly of my own will, and would choose you again if the whole world and every stone in it had named another woman. They'll hate me for it, she said. But she was smiling and weeping, and her hand was crushing mine, and the cloak of Anwilt was silver on her plain brown shoulders. Some of them, I agreed. For a while. They'll get over it or they won't, and either way you will be warm, and either way the light will be still, and either way you will never once, as long as I live, be alone with a single thing again. I swore that to you this afternoon on a clean floor, and I swear it again now on a waking stone in front of the whole hold, which is the most binding place in the kingdom to swear anything. I raised her up, gently, the two of us rising together off the risen silver stone. Stand with me, Aloan. Be Luna of Anwilt, and keep your seal. No one will ever again say the woman who tends it is beneath it. Yes, she said, and the hall, which had been holding its broken silence, heard it, and broke into a sound at last that was not a sob but a roar, the roar of 300 common folk who had come to watch a wrong and had been given, past all their hopping, a right. The undoing of the circle I will tell you quickly, because a true thing deserves the long telling and a rot deserves the short one, and I have spent enough of this account on Halding Crow. The seal's waking was witnessed beyond any appeal. 300 souls had seen the pale stone take light for one hand and stay dark as coal for the other, and a thing 300 people have seen with their own eyes cannot be argued away in a back room over a purse. But I did not leave it at the wonder. Wonders fade in the retelling. Men talk themselves out of what they saw. So the very next morning, in the same hall, before as many as could crowd back into it, old Bevis brought up the true records from the vault, his own 40 years of birth moons and blood lines, kept fair and honest across 4 decades, and read them, plain and dry, against Crow's beautiful reckoning. Where the two disagreed, he laid his old finger on the vellum and named it, quietly, one by one. Here the birth moon is written in the Luna's quarter. Here is my own record from the night of the lady's birth, the wolf's quarter, a fine common sign, no more. Here a royal thread is drawn into the Osmere tree. Here are 4 generations of that tree in my hand and my predecessors, and there is no royal thread in it and never was. An error, he said, runs both ways, sometimes for a house, sometimes against it. Every single error in Crow's reckoning ran to Ostmere. 100 coins, all landing the same face up, is not luck, it is a hand. And gold does not stay hidden once a hold has decided to go looking for it. Ostmere's coin was found in the keeping of 9 of the 11 gray judges, not hard to find. Once men who had been afraid of Crow stopped being afraid of him, which happened the moment the stone woke and the fear changed sides. Halding Crow did not deny it. At the last he was too proud to deny it. He had wagered his whole life and his whole craft on the old things being only stories, and he had lost the wager in front of the entire hold, and I believe the losing broke something in him that no sentence I could pass would ever reach. He was stripped of his office and his standing, and sent to keep the cold records of the northern marches, where the moon rises over empty snow, and there is no one left to buy, and nothing left to count but sheep. I am told he does it well and speaks to no one. I do not think about him much. Ostmere's house was stripped of its rank and sent north to hold the cold marches at its own expense, a mercy, and Lord Ostmere knew it was a mercy, and hated me for the mercy more than he would have hated a rope, because a rope would have let him die a wronged man in his own mind, and a mercy left him alive to know he had earned it. Lady Sabline I did not punish at all. She had been an instrument, not a hand aimed at the crown like an arrow by her father since her girlhood, never once asked whether she wished to fly. She went north with her house, and the last true word I had of her, some years on, was that she had married a plain herder up on the high marches and was, by every account, happier tending goats and children on a cold hillside than she had ever been reaching for a crown she had been pointed at like a weapon her whole life. I was glad of it. I bear her no ill. She and I were both, in our different ways, things other men tried to arrange. The circle itself we did not abolish. It was Aloan who would not have it, Aloan, who had every reason in the world to want the law that had wronged her torn down and burned to ash. A king who chooses his own mate by nothing but his own feeling, she said, is exactly the thing this law was built to prevent. You felt the truth about me, and you happened to be right, but the next king might feel a truth about a schemer and be wrong, and there'd be no circle and no seal to catch him. Don't tear it down because it was bought. That's letting the rot decide the shape of the house. Make it so it can't be bought again. So we did not tear it down. We changed one thing only, and it was her idea, and it is the wisest law I have made in all my years of making them. From that night, no verdict of the circle is sealed behind any door, ever again. Every naming, everyone is put to the seal in the pale hall before the whole hold. The seals witness that the letter had always allowed, and no wronged king had ever in 300 years been desperate enough to call. The circle still counts. The circle still names. Men are still men, and some men can still be reached with gold. But the moon seal witnesses now, every time in the open, in front of everyone, and a naming that must stand before the seal and the whole hold cannot be bought, because the one buyer who matters cannot be reached with any coin that was ever struck. Aloan took the very law that had been used to steal her life and turned it into the thing that would keep it from being stolen from anyone after her. That is the truest measure of her I know how to give you. I am told a king's tale should end with the crowning, the Luna crowned in gold, the great houses bending the knee, the borrowed law made new and shining. And all of that happened, and it was good, and I will not weigh you down with the pageant of it. It is the least true part. I would rather end where the tale is truest, which is a small place years on. The moonlight in the pale hall does not tremble any more. I do not fully understand it, and I have stopped needing to. The keepers say it settled the night the seal woke and has never gone restless since, that the hall was waiting, all those 300 years, for the one it was meant for, and having found her at last, is at peace. Perhaps that is only a story they tell now, the way people tell stories about the great nights after the fact. And perhaps it is only that I have stopped seeing the shiver, the way you stop seeing a thing you have finally understood. But I do not think so. I have watched that light a long time, longer than any man alive, and I tell you it lies still now, across the pale stone, the way it lay still the first gray morning I found a servant girl kneeling in it, and felt the whole of me go quiet for the first time in my life. She still keeps the seal. She is Luna of Anwilt and queen these many years, and the whole of the hold would trim its own 10,000 wicks with its own hands sooner than let her lift a cloth. And every morning before the sun, before the guard changes, she goes down into the pale hall alone and kneels beside the pale stone and wipes it clean, so the light has something clean to lie on. I gave up long ago telling her it is beneath her. Nothing is beneath her. She taught me that with her own 2 hands on a night when a stone woke and a lie died, and a lamp girl, the whole world had counted as nothing turned out to be the only wholly true thing in a hall full of arranged and purchased ones. Some mornings I go down and kneel beside her, king and old man though I am now, and we clean the old gray stone together in the still silver light, the 2 of us, saying nothing, the way we said nothing that first gray afternoon before the hardest night of our lives. She rests one hand flat on the stone, warm, at home, at peace, and rests her other hand in mine. The circle counts, the circle names, but the moon meant her, and the stone knew it, and so, at the last, and against all his own careful, borrowed, 300-year law, did the king.